Good morning, and welcome to First Edition, the online ministry of First Community Church. My name is Glenn Miles. I'm the senior minister here in this congregation, and we are thrilled that you've joined us on this day for worship. We want you to know, no matter who you are, where you're from, where you may be going, what you believe or what you don't believe, you are welcomed and accepted here as you are. It's a great church, and if this is your first time with us, you're going to love what you hear. Right now, there's a QR code up on the screen. We'd love for you to use the camera option on your phone to capture that code, click on the link that appears, and then register your attendance, a prayer concern. You can even give for the offering if you'd like to do so. Today, I'm presenting part 3 in my sermon series, Somehow Love Will Find a Way. It's inspired by Anne Lamott's book, Somehow. This is part 3. The title is Courage is Fear That Has Said Its Prayers. It's also inspired by something the Apostle Paul wrote to a young pastor named Timothy 2,000 years ago. For you have not been given a spirit of fear, but one of power and love. It's a beautiful text and a reminder that we don't have to let fear control our actions. I'm looking forward to sharing this sermon with you. Let's worship together.
The mountain my Lord spoke, out of his mouth came fire and smoke. Looked all around me, it looked so fine, till I asked my Lord if all was mine.
Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart,
Jordan River is chilly and cold. It chills the body, but not the soul. There ain't but one train upon this track. It runs to heaven and right back.
every time I feel this, every time in my heart I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving to my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I'll pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart,
A wizened, old, grizzled pastor named Paul, who knows he's near the end of his life, writes a deeply personal letter to his young friend Timothy, a man that Paul personally laid his hands upon and ordained him for Christian ministry. He writes to him and says, you've not been given a spirit of timidity or of fear. You've been given a spirit of power, ability, and love. Not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love. That love will strengthen you for all that you have to do in your life ahead. He's essentially saying to Timothy, yes, it's going to be difficult. Whether you're a pastor or a lay leader in a church, it's not an easy thing to do. You'll need a spirit of power. A better translation there is ability. You'll need a spirit of power and ability and fear in order to lead the church, because there'll be moments when you're not sure what to do, where you can go this way or that way, and no matter which way you go, someone's not going to be happy. But if you act from love, not from fear, your ministry will be blessed, even in those hard times, even in those difficult days, even though in those moments when it feels like maybe you've been left behind. You've not been given a spirit of fear, but a spirit of love. Because of that, you have the ability to face anything that life brings at you. This is a message that's repeated over and over and over again in the Bible. You remember Jesus teaching to the disciples, do you not? He quotes Moses. The great commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and also to love your neighbor as yourself. Then there's the Apostle John, who wrote to an early church and said, perfect love casts out fear. The Apostle Paul, writing to another church, writing to Corinth, the church in Corinth. You've heard these words before, but they're unbelievably true and powerful. There are 3 gifts given: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Our culture knows this as well. 2,000 years later, another Paul of the Beatles, sang an amazing song about love. What was it called? Can you remember? All You Need Is Love. Of course. Thank you very much. We have some old folks here. Remember the Beatles? Of course. All you need is love. We've been singing these words for 2,000 years and longer. Jesus goes all the way back to the time of Moses. For thousands of years, we've known at the heart of everything that matters in the world is our ability to put love at the center. Sometimes, though, especially in a world like ours at the moment, it's easy to give in to fear. In some ways, as I just said in the pastoral prayer a moment ago, it feels better to give in to fear, to give in to anger, to give in to cynicism, to just go sort of like a turtle, pull back into our shells, and hope no one hurts us. The church can do that too. I've seen churches devolve into anger and cynicism, where they get into a survival mode. Let's not dream, let's not vision, let's not think about how God wants to use us right now. Let's just pull inside and be frightened. Do you remember the story? I told this story a few years ago in my Bible study group. It's about a couple who has been to church, and they go to their favorite restaurant for dinner, for lunch. They don't have a reservation, but they think, we'll just try and see if we can get in. They get there, and the host is very gracious, and she says, no, we don't have any tables available, but if you'd just like to wait over here in our bar and take a moment there, we'll get you a table as soon as we possibly can. I'm sure it won't come up in a few minutes. They go into the bar, sit down. Of course, the server comes over then, and the server is doing her job, and she says, we have a wonderful happy hour right now. Can I bring you a beverage? Is there anything you'd like? The husband, the husband and wife says, not right now, thank you. We're just here for dinner, for lunch. We don't need anything to drink. Thank you very much. 10 minutes pass. They're still there, starting to get a little frustrated. The server comes by again, and she says, may I offer you a beverage? We have a wonderful happy hour. You should check out the menu. No, thank you. We're fine. We don't need anything. Another 10 minutes go. Now their frustration level's risen quite a bit. The same server, though, she's just doing her job. She comes over, and again, she says, may I get you? And before she can finish, the man says, look, lady, we go to church every Sunday. We're Christians. This is as happy as we're going to get. There's truth in that story. I don't know if the facts actually happened, but there's truth in that story, isn't there? Sometimes we can get stuck in that way of thinking where we just are going to get as happy as we can, and this is it. We're not able to see beyond our own selves, see the beauty that's already at work in the world. Are there frightening moments and days ahead of us? Of course there are. And at the same time, there's beauty everywhere. Anne Lamott, in her book Somehow, which is inspiring this sermon series, she says we need to remember that you and I are part of the animal kingdom, and that we need to be able to see how amazing we are, just as we would be if we saw animals in nature. You know, I told a story a couple of weeks ago about the time Julie and I led a family camp at Estes Park, at the YMCA of the Rockies in Estes Park, Colorado. This is a different story from that same week. It was a Tuesday night, I believe. Our evening was winding down. We'd had dinner together. We'd had our evening Vesper worship service. We had our evening program, which I think was water balloon volleyball. You can think how that went. It was hilarious and super fun. Now it's about 9 o'clock. It's dusk. The sun is setting. The younger children have gone off to bed. Out on the porch, there are about 20 of those Adirondack chairs, the ones I'm talking about, stretched out across this very wide open porch. Before us is this panoramic vista of the Rocky Mountains. It's unbelievably gorgeous. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, in almost complete quiet, a herd of about 20 elk comes walking right in front of us, no more than 10 feet away from the porch. It's one of the most awe-inspiring things I've ever seen. When I was a little boy, our school was taken on a trip up to Oregon. And we got to go to the place where the salmon climbed the fish ladders. Have you ever seen the salmon doing that? It's amazing. I didn't know this word tenacity, but boy, the tenacity they show that to climb those ladders, to continue their species, to continue life, it's unbelievable. It's awe-inspiring. The same thing is true of you and I. If we can just take a moment to look around and see who's out there and recognize all the stories, all the work, all the different moments of grace and kindness and forgiveness and love and joy, giving ourselves over to the world in the name of justice, it would be an amazing thing if we could open our eyes long enough and recognize it's not the spirit of fear that reveals those. It's the spirit of power and ability and love that allows us to see the world at work. Something like that is what happened to the disciple named Peter. That's the most amazing part in this story. It's not the rushing wind. It's not the tongues of flame. It's not people speaking in different languages and understanding what everybody else is saying. It's not that cacophony of voices in the wind and all the chaotic rush around it. I'd love to see a movie that could somehow replicate that. To me, the most amazing part comes a few verses later, when Peter stands up and delivers the first Christian sermon since the resurrection. He stands up in front of thousands of people and saying in a clear voice, "People of Judea, the Spirit of God is alive and well." And he quotes the prophet Joel. "This Spirit will come to your young men and your old women, your young women and your old men. It will come to slave and to free. This Spirit is going to go around the world and bring God's love right before you, even now in this moment." It's a beautiful sermon. It's an amazing sermon. But even more than the content of what he's saying is who Peter has become. You remember, don't you? You remember, don't you? On the night that Jesus is arrested, Peter pulls out his sword and tries to defend Jesus. Jesus says, "Put away the sword, Peter, and by the way, you're going to deny me 3 times before the sun rises." Peter, no, I would never do that. And then he does, 3 times. The next day when Jesus is put to death, where's his friend Peter? Hiding in fear. 50 days later, on the day of Pentecost, he's preaching a sermon that could cause him to be killed just like Jesus was, but he set that fear aside. Now, because his eyes are opened by that spirit, that same spirit of love, not a spirit of fear, he's transformed from a fear-filled disciple to a faith-filled preacher. It's a beautiful story of what happens when we let that spirit of love take over, guide us and strengthen us to see the world as it is. You know, Annie Lamott in her book also writes about the attic in her home. She waxes philosophically about this attic, and she discovers in thinking about it that there's something like love at work even in those boxes. Do you have some of those boxes of your kids' artwork from kindergarten and first grade? Maybe some old boxes up there in your attic or in your basement or in a spare closet, wherever you keep those things in the garage. Maybe you have some old newspaper clippings from back in the day when they were newspapers, and says this can reveal some love to us. She talks about her son Samuel has a whole collection of art that's in her attic. She also found a newspaper clipping back from when she was a young tennis star, one of the top tennis players in the entire state of California. She saved the clipping, which has now been nibbled on by mice and crawled over by spiders. And then she sort of pauses as she describes all this, though, and she says, on the surface of it, it seems absurd. I mean, really. What do these silly things mean? The artwork from kindergarten, the faded newspaper clipping that nobody else remembers. What do they mean? She says they represent a sweet courage. Not the kind of courage of a resistance fighter fighting against tyranny. No. Rather a bravery that chose to do hard things. Whether it was learn a lesson, to play tennis, to do an art project, or to learn to allow yourself to be known and loved. There's a sweet courage that comes when we allow ourselves to receive that spirit of love, to risk and be vulnerable enough for someone else to love us. You see, every item that you've got in your attic, your basement, in those boxes, wherever they are, every item is a story of you or someone you love that gives us the courage to love. In so many ways, that's what the Bible is. It's a collection of stories of people who were caught up in fear, caught up in worry, caught up by anxiety, and overwhelmed sometimes by life itself. And yet when they were finally caught up in the gift of God's love and grace, the whole world opened up to them. Do you remember the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis? Jacob's a scoundrel. He's a deceiver. He's not a good person. He's cheated his brother out of all kinds of things. His brother's name is Esau. Fast forward in his life to the moment he's on the other side of the river, waiting through the night until he has to face off with his brother Esau the next morning. He is scared to death. He wakes in the middle of the night and he begins to wrestle with an angel. You don't need a degree in psychology to understand what that dreamlike moment is. He's wrestling with that angel. He's wrestling with himself. He's wrestling with the fear he has about facing his brother. He might be killed by his brother. He doesn't know what's going to happen. Later in this dreamlike wrestling match, he realizes it's not an angel, it's God. It's about sunup. The sun's about to rise when God suddenly touches Jacob's hip, injures him, dislocates his hip. For the rest of Jacob's life, he walks with a limp, but for him, every step, every painful dragging of that bad leg is a reminder to him that he encountered God and survived, that he encountered God and received God's love, grace, and forgiveness. It's a beautiful story of how God comes to us and embraces us and gives us hope for the day ahead, for the days ahead. My professor at Claremont, Rolf Knierim, he was the chair of my dissertation committee. He says this is a resurrection story. The old Jacob is dead. The deceitful, lying cheater is dead. The new Jacob now is alive. He's alive through the power of God's goodness, grace, and love. What would happen in the church if we could embrace that same idea, if we could allow God's love to be at the center of who we are in everything that we do? But sometimes cynicism and anger feels better. I've met many people in my life who really are cynics. They describe themselves as realists, but they're cynics. They're not dreamers or visionaries. They just know everything's going down. It's all bad. Let's just be real about how bad things are, can we? Sometimes churches get stuck like that. Mark Yaconelli is a good friend of Anne Lamott's. Mark is a writer and a theologian, a very good one. That name might sound familiar to you. His father is Mike Yaconelli. Mike was a good buddy of mine back in the 90s. We served on the Amor Ministries Board of Directors. That's the group we build homes with in Mexico. Every spring, our young people travel out there to build homes with Amor. I've known them for 40 years in my ministry and my career. I don't know Mark, but he tells this amazing story to Anne about the little church that he was attending. When the pastor sent out an all-church email that said, I would like for us to be radically Jesus to our community. If you would like to be radically Jesus with me and treat our community that way, let's gather on Tuesday at 7 p.m. 20 people showed up. They went in the sanctuary, they took 20 chairs, put them in a circle, and they got to talking about what ideas do you have? I'd like to see a homeless shelter. I'd like to see us put solar panels all over the roof of the church. How about a soup kitchen? You know, there's some anti-LGBTQ plus voices in our community. Let's organize a pride parade. We're against those voices of exclusion. There's all kinds of ideas that popped up. An hour and a half later, though, the pastor said, these are great, but I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted. Every idea is born out of anger. Every idea is born out of frustration and fear. We can't function like this. Let's take a week off, go and pray, come back next week. They did. All 20 came back the next week, but this time they came back with printed out diagrams of how their individual ideas would run, and those individual persons, of course, are the ones who would be in charge of that program. And the next thing you know, they're arguing about whether it should be a soup kitchen or showers or a pride parade or whatever, and it just devolved into a terrible mess of a meeting until one young woman stood up and said, how about we learn how to practice being Jesus with each other first? The pastor said yes. They came back another week later. Their group was down to 10. But in that smaller circle, she said, who needs a radical Jesus in their life? One woman who's trying to lose a couple of pounds raised her hand and said, I live alone. Sometimes I don't have the energy to go for a walk. Are there a couple of you who go for a walk with me during the week? 2 hands immediately went up from 2 other women. Another woman raised her hand and she said, I love to cook and entertain, but the last time I did this, I invited a couple over. He's a vegan, she's a vegetarian. I didn't have anything to feed them. I was so embarrassed. I forgot about their food requirements. And I've been too afraid to have a party. How many of you would be willing to come over to my house for dinner? The 9 other people, all of them raised their hands. Said, we'll come over. We'll be happy to come over, please. Somebody else said, I'm not a handyman. I can't put in a light bulb. Is there anybody here who'd be willing to train me on how to take care of my house? A couple more hands went up. Mark Yaconelli, who tells the story, said, I'm a workaholic. I sometimes get so honed in. I forget about my wife. I forget about my children to the detriment of my family. Would somebody be willing to come and pray with me for a couple hours once a week to remind me of my family and my ultimate concern for them? The pastor raised her hand and said, yes, I will. And then months later, all those dreamed of ideas, most of them came true. And Ann writes, isn't it amazing the work that love can do? Now, if you're a different kind of church, you would have amen this statement. Isn't it amazing what work that love can do? Isn't it amazing what love can do when we let it be at its work among us? Isn't it amazing what love can do? And I still can't hear any amens. Thank you very much. Thank you. Isn't it amazing what would happen to us if we fully began to live and act that way as a church? To not act out of fear, to not act out of worry or cynicism or anger, but out of love, because we've been given a spirit not of fear, not of timidity, but a spirit of love. Rob Bell, maybe you know that name. He wrote the book Love Wins. And he wrote that book and he was forced out of his job because that church didn't like that kind of theology. Most of his speaking engagements were canceled because those groups didn't like his theology, but he doesn't care. He continues to share that word. He's found a different way to express his voice, and he believes that God's love wins, that God's love goes to everyone. Where did he get this idea? He got it from Moses and Jesus and the Apostle Paul in his letter to a young man named Timothy. What would happen if this became the central point for who we are as a church? What would happen if we captured that same spirit that was alive and well at 1320 Cambridge Boulevard more than 100 years ago? A spirit not of fear and timidity, but a spirit of love. What would happen if we could recapture that love even now? Even now. Let us find the courage. Because after all, as Anne says, courage is just fear that has said its prayers. Let's find that courage now to be the people that God calls us to be. Amen.
Come, breath of God, blow in from the four winds, rise up from the north and the south, and sweep in from the east and the west. This is the hour, hear our cry. Oh, come breathe what's dead back to life. There's work here that only you can do. So God, hear our prayer breaking through. Come, breath of God. Come, breath of God. More than the comforts of earth, God, we say that we need you. And more than the outcomes, the answers, we say that we trust you. And more than the fame of this world, God, we say that we love you. And we long to find favor in your eyes. Oh, Spirit, don't pass us by. Come, breath of God, blow in from the four winds, rise up from the north and the south, and sweep in from the east and the west. 'Cause somehow our eyes have grown dim, and we long for your vibrance again. And we fear that our love will grow cold. So come set a fire in our bones.